November 24th, 2020. This is Channel 2 doing an investigation. Without this investigation, the cover-up would have continued, is the bottom line. And it's unemployment. They're now saying that there were 35,000 inmates and prisoners in California that received $140 million in compensation. I don't know over what time span, if it's just in 2020. I'll play the piece. But I want to just say a couple things first before I play the piece. One is, if there can be this much rampant fraud in the California unemployment, the EDD, Employment Development Department, if there can be this much fraud there that went unnoticed until it was exposed, then why are we so sure that there was no fraud in the voting for 2020? It seems to me that if you're giving out 66 million ballots all over the country that technically have no value to them, what is it about those? The only value they have is if you use them, basically, right? But there are people who want to use them, so that's the value. So what system was it that they were able to do for the voting system that they could now put in place for the EDD in California to prevent fraud? So if we have $140 million in fraud just from the prison system in California, that doesn't count young kids who are being claimed, false identities, self-employed people who maybe weren't even working, people out of state, possibly people who've passed away. When we add those all up, we're probably over $1 billion in fraud in California. And it just makes one wonder, if you can have that much rampant fraud, giving out money, cutting checks, taxpayer checks, and it went undetected until the Channel 2 reported it, how is it not possible that there wasn't voter fraud in 2020? I mean, just complete shutdown of discussion and the story. Everything was perfect. We took all the ballots and ran them through. Whether the ballots were valid or not, we had some ways to detect, but not always. You know, not everyone had bar graphs. There were just so many things that never really got discussed. I just don't get the connection here, how we can have all this fraud for cutting checks, actually cutting money and giving it out to people, but there was no fraud in the voting. It seems to me it would be backwards. It would be, you'd have no fraud when it comes to giving out money because the state wants their money, right? But there might be fraud in the ballots because you're just giving out ballots. People can't cash them in. That's just how I would look at it. But hey, I'm just somebody asking questions, right? What do I know? I mean, this way makes more sense, right? Let's just give out checks like they're paper money and wait until somebody exposes what's going on. So just one more note before I play this. Every year there's almost 100,000 medical mistakes. 100,000 people die from preventable medical errors in the United States. A fraction, probably less than 1%, ever get an apology, let alone any kind of compensation or any kind of a break in any way. Okay? Think of those people when you watch this clip. Think of all the people out there who've been just had their life turned upside down. Think of the victims of crime who never got compensated, an apology or anything, as you watch this piece.
As out-of-work Californians struggle to collect unemployment benefits, an investigation reveals tens of thousands of prison inmates have had no trouble collecting millions of dollars. CBS 2's Jasmine Veal has details on what's called the biggest fraud investigation in state history.
Alessandro Machi is awaiting execution in San Quentin State Prison for the murder of 8-year-old Palmdale boy Gabriel Fernandez, who was abused, tortured, and beaten to death in 2013. According to an investigation by a group of state and federal prosecutors, Aguirre is among dozens of death row inmates who received California unemployment benefits in recent months.
The total amount through August that we know of is $420,000 in the name of death row inmates. Who's on that list? A lot of notorious people of names, claims filed in their names.
Today, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert revealed widespread fraud she says is happening in our prisons and jails through the state's Employment Development Department.
Tens of thousands of inmates, local, state, and federal.
She says last month prosecutors became aware of the massive problem and formed a task force to tackle it.
The highest single claim paid is close to $20,000.
In a letter to the governor this week, the California District Attorney's statewide EDD Fraud Task Force detailed the staggering numbers. They found there were more than 35,000 claims filed between March and August in the names of inmates, and 20,000 of those claims have been paid out, totaling more than $140 million.
I saw people on the list that I personally prosecuted, and I'm like, oh my God, they're like people doing murders and rapes, and they're in there forever.
You know, 2020, the unbelievable. E.D.D.
She says rap videos like this one on YouTube have people showing off how they were able to dupe the system.
I mean, and quite frankly, they're mocking us, they're flouting it, they're laughing at us because it's so rampant.
She did say some inmates could have had their identity stolen. These are just the latest allegations that highlight the ongoing problems the EDD has had dealing with the massive number of claims during this pandemic.
The reality is there's no system in place in California to cross-check the prison data. It's just like wildfire.
The governor responded saying he has already taken action, saying in part that based on that direction, EDD and the CDCR in partnership with the U.S. Department of Labor worked to match Social Security numbers of those in state custody to identify the scope of the problem and to hold people accountable. The EDD says it has been working to identify suspect claims, and it has enhanced prevention efforts like working with cybersecurity experts during this unprecedented time. Here in the newsroom, Jasmine Beal, CBS 2 News.
Can you imagine when Governor Newsom was having his restaurant party while everyone else was quarantined, and they're about to quarantine all the restaurants everywhere? Can you imagine he's out there just, you know, having a good old time while this fraud is going on? We're literally talking $1 million a day of fraud just from what's being paid out to prisoners. It literally works out to that. Okay, that's just the prisoners. Doesn't mention any of the other things. So now somebody might argue, well, you know, that money probably ended up, you know, with the family, and they needed the money and this and that. I mean, you could probably go there if you want, but when you enforce rules and laws against law-abiders and then allow the people who broke the law to just collect money, somebody has to resign. Newsom, you have to resign over this. If there's one thing you could have done, it would have been to vanguard the money. You and Garcetti were lobbying Trump for more and more funding while you were literally letting millions of dollars go out a day fraudulently. I mean, this is insanity. And the Attorney General of California, Becerra, he oversaw this. He didn't do anything about this. He's going to get promoted now. I guess there's that thing about you promote failures, right? The Peter principle. You keep promoting people up to new positions because they have experience, even if their experience was around failureism. You know, let's add that to all the things this year. We've talked about racism and sexism and ageism. What about failureism, right? How many people are being promoted for being failures? And California seems to be ground zero. Do you realize, and California's Democrat everywhere, governor, mayors, 45-7 in Congress, Democrat-centric. We have a supermajority of Democrat politicians in California. And while they're screwing up in California, they were going after Trump on impeachment charges. Without California's congressional leaders, without their 45-7 margin, Trump would never have been impeached. And the country could have focused on other things instead, like preparing for a pandemic. But instead, they went after Trump while their own state was the most corrupt of all in letting money out to people who never should have got the money. So it's almost, and one other thing, when they were accusing Trump of quid pro quo, our own California people who led the way, Adam Schiff and whoever else that were leading the way, they were doing the same thing in California for the last 30, 40 years, quid pro quos. So why don't you clean up, and this is what I've heard this one philosophical argument over the years, always clean up your own act before you go out after others. And as a compromise, if you are going to go after others, at least be cleaning up your act at the same time. And that's obviously wasn't done in California. And now we're going to get 4 years of another 10 million undocumented. Now after all the money they've already given out, this is the Democrats just bribing everybody, and all the law abiders are being left behind to handle the debt because they're legal. They're honest people. The honest people are being put below everyone who's breaking the law. Between undocumented and all of what you're hearing here in California, California rewards lawlessness. That should just be the state motto.